fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 5, A Royal Pain. Whatever paralytic compound in that concoction the old woman had stabbed Eric with had been potent. He had begun to stir, rising fitfully from a dreamless sleep, his limbs and body much too heavy to lift. The mattress he was laying on was painfully stiff, and he could still smell the stringent aroma of disinfectant. It burned his nostrils. His mind was swimming, drifting in and out of awareness as he struggled to escape his sleep paralysis. But the only thing of his that was working the way it was supposed to, apart from the absolute rumbling of his stomach, were his ears. The distant buzzing of sounds crashed down over him, and he began to slowly make sense of them. A murmur of conversation, ducks' nails clacking noisily against the clean tiles, and the opening and shutting of the only door to his room. Someone had left, given the silence that surrounded him. "Indiga, I insist you abandon this venture with this elf and come home." The tone of Indiga's mother's voice did not imply she liked Eric very much. He would click his tongue against his teeth, if he could. "Ma, please!" Indiga shifted in his seat somewhere in the room, the cheap leather covering of the chair squeaking in protest. "You said the same thing when I left to chart the ice flows for the first time. But being a cripple doesn't make me weak. I can handle myself." There was a slurping sound of a drink being sipped on and a very pregnant pause. After several seconds sank by, Indiga spoke again. "There must be something bigger at play here. Some divine providence. What are the odds that I would stop on that island to forage for berries in that area?" Eric, still struggling against his invisible bonds of sleep paralysis, froze. A lot had happened in the last week and a half, and no one could blame him for failing to notice just how ridiculously lucky he had been. He survived being thrown from the tower window, the terrifying flight through an unknown gateway, and his eventual plummet to the earth. Sure, maybe he had blind luck on his side, but divine providence? Like any god anywhere ever cared about him. "But what if he's dangerous, dear? Your father and I are worried about you." Indiga let out a hearty, warm, and genuine laugh, and he continued to laugh until, judging by the gasp, his sides ached. "Don't fret, Ma. I'm going to take him to the Temple of Kidayani. I know she'll have some answers for me. And if he actually does have a dangerous bone in his body, well, we'll have Grammy remove that too." The two Selkies shared a moment of laughter before sipping silently at their drinks. Sagani set her cup down on a counter somewhere. "Where has your grandmother gone?" There was the sound of a dog being scratched behind its ears. The thunk, thunk, thunk of a happy tail followed shortly after. "Oh, removing his toes were easy," she said, "but there's still some trace blood flow in his fingers, and she wants a second opinion before operating on them." What? Eric almost missed the increase in his own heartbeat, as it was timed nearly perfectly with Duck's delighted bouncing at attention. His breathing grew faster, making his already addled mind even more lightheaded. Toes, whatever. Who really needs toes anyway? But he needed his fingers. He used them for, well, everything. Like building machines, writing equations, saving the world. He hadn't really put any effort into actually breaking free. He was still numb all over. He'd have no way of knowing if he succeeded, but now he had one hell of a reason to start. He strained every muscle as best he could, trying to sit up and break free from his sleep paralysis. He felt an involuntary jerk of his knee, slamming the back of it against the surface he was lying on. That was all he needed. That one small movement, and he began to regain feeling in the rest of his body, his nerves returning to life. His hand shot up into the air, struggling to grasp onto something to pull himself up, which he succeeded in doing when Eric felt his fingers latch onto someone's shoulder. They were short, but standing, and judging by the scream that nearly deafened him, he had surprised Indiga's mother.
"Whoa, relax, Ma. Grammy said he might come too."
There was a shuffle.
"She said he just needs another injection of this." Nope."
Eric wanted these words to be shouted from his mouth, but all that came out was a sluggish and weak He felt claustrophobic in his own body, his heart racing as he realized there was no possible way to fight them off. He lashed out, subconsciously calling on Wraith to protect him, pulling at his shade to form a barrier around his skin. But his shadow bug no longer lived there, and something inside him tore. A crackling, red energy rippled up his body, blinding him and causing Indiga's mother to scream again. The pain was excruciating. The most horrific sensation he had felt in his miserable life. It was like he was being torn apart, one atom at a time, put back together only to be disassembled once more. He wailed and screamed, but no sound came from his mouth. And when he was certain he was done for, ready to be disintegrated in that red laser beam of light, everything dissolved into black, and he hung, weightless in the nothingness. In the chaos of his mind, there was only room enough for him to realize he hadn't burned up into a crisp. Eric struggled to make his eyes see anything other than, well, nothing. And just as his brain flipped from, "This is not good," to, "Maybe I am dead," there was a pull in his gut and a loud pop. His feet connected with solid ground, and, still under the effects of a paralytic sedative running through his veins, he crumpled into a heap, his back hitting a wall and knocking the air from his lungs. He blinked several times, struggling to pull in a gasp. He couldn't feel the pain, but that didn't stop his need for oxygen. He sucked in a wheeze when he felt a gentle breeze rustle his hair, and he slowly pried his eyes open to a pristine blue sky dotted with white clouds. Eric had the sudden thought that he must be dreaming again. He tried waking himself, but the bustling sound of footfall grabbed his attention. Forcing his body to obey him was a feat in itself, but he managed to move his gaze. He was sitting, half-slumped, on the busy sidewalk of what looked to be a downtown shopping district. Pedestrians walked around him, or over him, some complaining loudly about homeless people and their drugs, while others offered him more sympathetic glances. For a dream, this was really vivid. These people were looking right at him, stepping over his outstretched legs that still refused to move. He looked over at them. His feet were heavily bandaged with only a few blood-stained stumps where his toes once sat. And with his dirty clothes, unkempt hair, and a scraggly beard, Eric realized he certainly looked the part of a vagrant. He blinked away the tears for the loss of his toes and gazed around for anything to focus on instead. The smell of bakeries and coffee shops floated along the warm summer breeze, and he saw, standing crooked on its foundation across from him, a too tall, too narrow little store. A sun-bleached sign hung above its door, the letters barely legible anymore. But he'd recognize those two words. Used books. It looked just like the one he and his brother used to visit when they were younger, greedily reading just about everything they could reach. Another pedestrian stepped over him, tossing a coin at him and grumbling about being right in the way. Eric followed the man with his eyes, and the sparkling golden dome of a town hall set atop marble stairs caught his attention. This was home? His father had once gathered the town in that building, warning them of the encroaching dangers discovered by his research. The memory made Eric chuckle, but all that came out was a drunk-sounding hiccup. Perhaps it was being surrounded by a cozy dream filled with familiar scents and sights, or maybe Eric had simply wished hard enough that the universe conjured the man into existence. Whatever it was, he spotted a faded, dusty cowboy hat in the crowd. He'd recognize it anywhere, even if the man's face was hidden behind a large paper map. He was walking down the street towards the heart of the town, towards him. There could be no doubt in Eric's mind. This was his father. That sheepskin collar of his black leather bomber jacket couldn't hide the vibrant blue Hawaiian shirt underneath. Dad? Whatever it was that fell out of his paralyzed mouth certainly wasn't that word, and the man didn't even react to his presence as he passed by. Eric had caught a glimpse of his father's profile. It was him. And, as if that wasn't enough proof, the joyful laughter of two children playing tag in his long shadow sealed it. One was about 5, the other 3, and they both had tiny, pointed ears and identical mops of black hair. The older boy had thick glasses that sat slightly askew on his face with a shock of white hanging over his bright blue eyes. His heart thumped faster as he watched his younger self run to catch up with the man, laughing and giggling. This wasn't a dream. This was torment. There was another tiny chuckle, and he pulled his gaze away to see a toddler version of his brother standing before him. Little Vel stared at him with wide green eyes, sucking on the neckline of his shirt before he reached down with fat, chubby fingers to touch one of Eric's bandaged feet. No, we don't touch strangers. Tears were already stinging his eyes to see his brother, happy and all in one piece, but at the sight of a woman rushing to scoop up the child, Eric's heart climbed into his throat and settled in. And not just because she was his mother, her elven features were recognizable anywhere, but because she was walking. She was moving about, unhindered, on her own 2 feet. He raised a shaking hand towards her, aware of what he must look like, filth-stained and blackened fingers. But he didn't care. Tears were streaming down his cheek at the sight of her. No cane, no crutches, no chair. Just like his brother, she was whole. Eric's mother offered him an apologetic smile, one someone would give to a stranger, and she hefted the giggling Vel higher into her arms. She dug around in a pocket of her jeans and pulled out a couple of crumpled dollar bills and some loose change. She knelt down, observing him for a moment, before she placed the money at his feet and quickly followed her family. His black, shaking hands reached for the money, plucking up $1, and he unfolded the bill. He could touch it, feel its texture between his thumb and pointer fingers. This was not a dream. He stared down at the wrinkled visage of George Washington and knew he was home. Eric began to force his body into motion, trying to get to his hands and feet to crawl after them, when something grabbed him hard on the shoulder and yanked him backward without warning, into the wall. The vibrant world around him, the people and cars, noises and bakery smells, vanished in the instant he was tugged through the most painful portal. He screamed, a useless reaction as nothing came from his mouth, and then he felt the motion of everything come to a violent halt as he slammed into the hard surface of nothingness. Once again, he remained motionless, dangling in the air by invisible strings in a void of darkness. It didn't matter which direction he looked. It was simply too black to see anything. That is, until a pinprick of light was lit, like a lone candle on a far-off birthday cake. And then another, and another. An entire cosmos was being born into existence right before him. Whirling galaxies shimmered in 1,000 different colors, and nebula clouds of stardust hung in the air above him. Eric stared in awe as he spun, realizing his toeless feet were touching something solid. Everything was rotating around him. He was the center of this universe. "Little false king, you're lucky I found you." The voice that spoke was booming and ethereal, but also a gentle whisper at the same time. It came from all around him, inside him, and right next to his left ear. The paralytic concoction was waning, and his hand shot up to touch it, feeling the prickling sensation left by warm breath. But there were only innocent, winking stars no matter where he looked. "It is high time we have a conversation." In other words, Eric was fairly certain he was about to become a meal for some eldritch god. He swallowed hard. Crack! Pyra had just managed to dodge an incoming stone that was aimed for her head when another hit the side of the carriage and her foot slipped on the metal steps. She toppled clumsily out onto the inner courtyard of Bastion Hall. As another stone flew by her, one of the Kingsguard barked a command, and a line of soldiers began pushing against the gathered mob of citizens just outside the inner portcullis, pressing them back towards the outer gate. The prince was already at her side, helping Pyra steady on her feet. He asked her with a look if she was hurt, and she sighed with a shake of her head. "I'm fine, just surprised." From the moment their procession had hit the outer edges of Ebonvane, they had been assaulted by screaming mobs of angry and displaced citizens. She hadn't been expecting a warm homecoming, but this was far more visceral than she had prepared for. "Your Majesty!" The sound of her title caused Pyra to look up. 3 members of the council, all clad in varying shades of crimson and white, were running across the courtyard in their direction. "Your Majesty!" The pale pink woman came to a stop before the queen, her ivory blonde hair tangled around a set of curling horns. "Thank the goddess you have returned. The city below is in chaos." The representative of their northernmost regions moved before her, built like a blacksmith with thick calloused fingers tangled nervously in his ashen beard.
"Please tell us you bring good tidings. The guards can't hold them back for long, and many are starting to defect."
Defect? Pyra's mind spun. I don't understand. What is going on? Behind them, the tapping of Lucian's cane descended the carriage steps.
"Oh, did I forget to mention? Elias's little experiment placed a new mountain range right through the middle of the city. Thousands missing, untold dead, looting, riots, starvation."
He took a minute to brush an imaginary speck of dust off his sleeve.
"I swore I mentioned it at some point. Well, must have slipped my mind."
She stared at him blankly, the insult completely lost in the magnitude of the information. Her eyes drifted up to the peaks of Bocatera, the obsidian black mountain range that acted as the barrier between Ebra and the enshrined wilds. It was also home to Bastion Hall, the glittering castle carved right out of a sheer cliff face of the mountain, and the sprawling, multi-tiered city of Ebonvane beneath. As her eyes scanned the gold-flecked black crags and precipices, she could spot large swaths of dusty brown scree completely foreign to this area. Whatever mountains had been pulled across into their world had come free from the hard stone that made up the region. A rock slide, miles in either direction.
"Is the king with you?"
A small human-shaped man trotted up to the others, though he barely reached their knees, his fluttering gossamer wings catching the early rays of sunlight. Pyra's breath hitched in her throat as the question ripped her back to the present. She had spent most of the journey dipping in and out of fitful attempts at sleep, but it hadn't been until the last hour that she managed not to spiral into thinking of the mess she had left behind or the man she once called husband. But hearing his title forced the image of a burning purple gaze beneath twisting antlers to the front of her mind. Her fingers moved subconsciously to her throat as she began to stammer. Seeing her hesitation, Varen stepped up beside her. He shook his head and signed, "The king is not here and will likely not return. Speak your concerns." The three representatives just stared blankly at him until someone from the rear carriage shouted,
"He says, don't hold your breath."
Evan hopped down next to Barry, who had already disembarked, and made his way over to the trio of suits.
"Elias ain't with us, and I don't think he's coming back anytime soon."
Pyra managed a nod.
For now, you may address your concerns to me."
The heavy man from the north raised an eyebrow.
"Unfortunately, you do not have the power to govern this council. Not until we have proof of the king's abdication."
"Enough!"
Pyra held up her hand.
"I am the queen, and regardless of my husband's whereabouts, you will defer to my judgment in his absence."
The horned woman pointed at the gates where the guards still fought back the frothing mob.
"The city below is in chaos. Most of it is gone."
Her worried violet eyes scanned up at Bo-Katan.
"The citizens are desperate for aid, but our stores will run dry in a month if we succumb to their demands."
Lucian's cane cracked smartly against the cobblestones.
"Then let the rebels starve. We have more pressing matters."
Pyra shot him a look, but her anger wavered. Be it from exhaustion, or the fact that, yes, there were bigger matters in the grand scheme of things, she wasn't certain. Either way, it filled her with the desire to give up. But she was queen first, and she was, in large part, to blame for the lack of preparedness on the council's behalf. In her desperation to deal with Elias's single-minded goal of eradicating the Brotherhood, Pyra had allowed her royal duties to fall to the wayside. She pressed her fingers to her forehead, her knees giving an unsteady tremble. Varen gripped her arm, keeping her upright. He might not hold station any longer, but he knew Pyra's mind. He signed, "If the people are hungry, then feed them. If they need places to sleep, then house them." As Evan translated, the fairy's face paled.
"How are we to accomplish all of that?"
His fingers shook as he looked to the gates where people were crying and shouting just on the other side, then back at the three members of their ever-growing council. Something hot and angry began to bubble up from deep within, bursting out in a fiery torrent.
"If you can eat, so shall they!"
The sound of his voice echoed off the stone walls, causing the council members to step back, their mouths hanging open. Even the mob was shocked, losing much of its steam to see their heads on pikes. Pyra spared the prince a worried glance, then added,
If our food stores can buy a month, then that is a month in which we have to find a solution. Start there and work forward. Now is not the time to rule, but to serve." The three exchanged a skeptical look, but they nodded and swept away, moving back towards the keep.
"It looks like you've grown a spine in your time away, little brother."
Lucian hobbled up next to the prince, the tapping of his cane echoing out in the expanse of the courtyard. He pulled to a stop before the two royals, a bored expression glazing over his features.
"Now, if you're quite done kowtowing to the riffraff,"
he paused, gesturing toward the castle,
"the next leg of our journey is a long one, and I am eager to get this little reunion over with."
She was numb to the words in her ears. The people, her people, were scared, angry, and most of all, desperate. Regret weighed heavy on Pyra's shoulders, but she shoved it down with a sigh and turned to the once regent lord. "No, we will take a day and a night to prepare and set out tomorrow." She took a quick glance over her shoulder at the gates. "That will give me time to settle what I can with food distribution and—"
"We do not have time for your humanitarian concerns."
Her nerves were an open wound, and desperate as Pyra was to control her emotions, her thin facade of calm countenance was shattered. But a voice from behind him saved her the effort.
"Oi, you! The pompous prick in the fancy dress!"
The remainder of their new companions had stumbled out of their carriages, and the young girl who shared Pyra's face was casually strolling up to Lucian. She looked tiny in the large red coat that Vel had gifted her, but somehow the expression she wore was more of a reminder of the cyborg.
"For as I can tell, she's the queen and you're a nobody. So shut your yap and listen, or are we going to have a problem?"
Piper clenched her mechanical fingers into a fist. Pyra turned to the girl, holding up a hand, and in a low tone spoke,
"I know you're angry. Please don't start a fight here now."
She turned back to Lucian.
"We have all been through an ordeal and need a moment to breathe."
He leaned against his cane, sneering down at the pair.
"Mother will not be pleased at having to wait."
"She will be displeased then. We cannot march into the enshrined wilds to seek an audience with her, appearing as we are right now. Everyone here needs a bath, a hot meal, and a good night's rest."
Pyra felt a dark smile curling the corners of her mouth as she stared at the man who had once fancied himself a monarch, who had made her life a living hell.
"But the girl does make a fair point. I don't need to explain myself further, as you no longer have an opinion in this castle."
Lucian's face twisted in disgust, and a low growl escaped his lips as he swiveled on his heel, the crimson ends of his cloak snapping out behind him as he barked at the maids and attendants that had lined up at the castle entrance. She turned to thank the girl, but she had already stalked off to join the rest of her group. The tall man with auburn hair was rubbing his backside and complaining loudly about the lack of cushions in the carriage, which the girl ardently ignored. Her brother, however, was a beacon of childish delight as he ran through the stables, examining each carriage and petting every horse. The bear had already lumbered away from all the others and was ambling through the open doors, much to the dismay of the staff. When Evan caught the queen watching them, he offered her a pair of half-hearted thumbs up and a weak smile.
"He's headed for the kitchens. Don't worry. I'll look after him."
As soon as the two others managed to corral the boy, they followed as well, with Atticus rushing ahead in excitement to see a real castle. The prince placed his hand on Pyra's arm, and she leaned into him. Her eyes followed the girl. So much damage, lives lost or altered,
She shrugged slightly. Everything keeps changing. He reached a hand to her cheek, bringing her eyes up to meet his. She gave a sad chuckle and nuzzled the hand. Well, almost everything. Pyra stayed there for a long moment, lost in the oasis amid the torrent of chaos. Eventually, she tapped at the gentle gesture and pulled away. I must make myself presentable before I address the public. She looked up at him, a sad smile tugging at her face. And you should do the same. He watched her go, his hand falling to his side. And in the blink of an eye, Herron found himself standing alone. The drivers had taken the horses to the stables. The crowd at the gates had begun to disperse under the onslaught of the guards. He took a deep breath, centering himself. He had put something off for long enough. With a nod, he looked down at his shadow. It blinked up at him. He signed down at the creature, trying his best to seem inconspicuous in case anyone was watching. But his shadow only tilted its head at him, curious.
I don't know how to read your fingers, but you can speak to me in your mind, and I will hear it.
For the first time, he heard Wraith's voice in his head. He knew that Eric had spoken with the creature often, but he had expected the voice to be more malevolent or dark. Instead, it was tiny and shameful, drowned in a well of sadness. Not wanting to stand in the middle of the courtyard, Herron began to climb the set of stone steps that led up to the inner ramparts. As he moved, he formed the words in his mind. You are the one speaking, through me. Wraith shook his head, walking slightly out of step with his host's body.
That was you, with your voice. I just used a bit of my shade to help you speak.
Herron was silent for a moment. He wasn't sure how to feel about this new, unexpected companion. The thing had leapt to him when he and Eric had fought in the abandoned house. He had felt the change, but it hadn't been until his fight with Vel that he fully realized what had happened. The cyborg should have crushed him, but hadn't. It had even shoved the doctor away to protect his brother. But Elias had succumbed to the siren's call of power. Eric, too. His brother had slowly gone mad, turned dark by the creature that sat in his heart. And the doctor had been twisted into doing unspeakable acts.
I'm not evil. At least, I don't think I am. I tried to stop him, but It
was too hard to say his friend's name.
He wouldn't listen.
Herron stopped dead in his tracks as he reached the top of the stairs. He hadn't even formed the words in his mind, but it had heard his thoughts. The shadow shook its head once more.
I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to, but your shade is very, very damaged. Your thoughts slip through the cracks, and I can't help but hear them.
Herron closed his eyes. Is that why I can't talk? My shade is damaged.
Yes. Without it, you would die. But yours is like a tattered sail on a ship. I can only repair parts of it, and only for a little bit. It uses me to do so, and it hurts.
Elias had broken him in ways he hadn't even realized. Is there any chance of saving my brother?
From Rivaria?
The shadow cast its sad yellow eyes down and away.
She devoured his shade, draining him until it and his mind were gone. No one could survive that.
Varen sank forward, bracing himself against the crenellated edge of the rampart, now high enough that he could see out across the devastated city below. Elias had been infected even before he had returned. He knew, damn it, he knew, and he let his brother send him away, stayed away because he thought giving the man his space would be best. He slumped down against the stone wall. He should have tried harder. Should have remained in the tower. Should have. He hid his head beneath his arms, sobbing silently, alone above the ruined world he had loved. Everything had changed. Even him. Standing atop what felt like a glass surface that protected the spinning stars, Eric didn't know where to begin in order to wrap his brain around what was happening. He had just seen his mom and his brother whole and happy, and his father, the man was actually there. But in the jumble of emotions, joy, confusion, and jealousy, panic began to rise. The spinning arms of the celestial whirlpool broke across his feet like the lapping waves of an ocean, sending up a spray of microscopic stars and planets. His hand was still touching the ear where the voice had spoken to him, but it was pushed to the back of his mind as he watched entire solar systems be born and die at his feet. He had never felt so small and insignificant before, so very aware of his size in the grand scheme of things.
You dabble in dangerous magic, little elf king.
That voice, the one that spoke through him and against him, had returned. He spun, looking for the source. Dangerous magic? Eric was only half aware that he spoke. The voice coming from his mouth was so tiny he didn't recognize it. Who are you? What do you mean? A tall, black fin broke across the cosmos, moving slowly toward him. Eric pushed his palms against his eyes and rubbed furiously for several seconds. When he opened them, the cosmic creature was gone, leaving only ripples in the universe.
You place me in a difficult situation.
That black fin surfaced once more and began cutting through the waves of the universe toward him. Eric attempted to retreat. Who would want to be a snack for a cosmic-sized megalodon? But his mangled feet couldn't balance his weight. He stumbled, landing hard on his rump with a splash that sent heavenly bodies spinning away. The fin came to a stop before him, and, with a spout of air that was filled with stars, a whale surfaced. An orca, to be precise. It was an impossibly dark shade of black. The usually white markings of it were made up by the deteriorating trail of space dust that spiraled to a black hole at the center of its body. 2 blue pinpricks of light opened near the head, and their eyes met.
Time magic is not one to toy with. I was lucky to find you before you ruined everything.
Eric's panic calmed, replaced by need. Time magic? You mean that was real? I traveled to the past? His mind raced. No equipment? No hopeless equations, just limitless possibility. How? The whale let out a dramatic sigh and plunged below the surface of the cosmos, reappearing before him in a spray of stardust. Not as an orca, but as a woman.
She had soft brown skin and sharp features. Beneath a silver band around her head, her long black hair was separated into 2 braids that tickled the tips of her toes. She wore heavy leather garments, cleverly designed to mimic the black hole pattern she wore in her celestial form.
As I feared, mortals are such small-minded creatures, ever searching for power.
With a scowl, she reached a hand towards him.
The gift of altering time is not supposed to exist, and it certainly cannot be trusted in your hands.
Wait! Eric scrabbled away, staying just out of reach of the cosmic entity. I don't want power! I just want to fix what I broke. She paused, looking at him closely for a long moment. Eric felt something inside his mind, reaching and searching through his memories. It didn't hurt, but it left a chilling sensation that haunted him.
You speak true, or at least you think you do. In some ways, that is even worse.
She let out a huff.
You may call me Kidaini.
Kidaini? He vaguely recalled Indiga using that name. He sensed the danger, while not gone, may have lessened. If you saw my memories, then you understand why I need to go back. There was a desperation in his voice he hadn't intended.
You cannot change the past.
Her voice boomed out through the universe, rattling the galaxy beneath their feet. I have to do something. I can't live with the weight of my sins. She studied the half-elf for what felt like an eternity. And for her, it very well could have been. What was time to a celestial entity? Kidaini sighed and held down her hand, offering it up to the little man.
Only one god has ever possessed time magic, and they and their followers were relentlessly hunted to preserve the past. You're lucky I sensed a breach between your 2 halves, past and present, and was able to find you through the rift you created.
Eric felt himself hoisted to his feet by a mitten-clad pair of hands, and he stared at this woman, confusion warring with curiosity. He opened his mouth, perhaps to ask more about this god and their followers, but she hushed him with a look.
Listen carefully, little king. Time was designed to flow in a single direction for a reason. By the laws of our universe, to protect that which has happened and what will happen, I am supposed to kill you here and now.
Kidaini took a step back. A tremor of fear ran through Eric, hard enough to cause the galaxy below him to ripple.
But you are not in the employ of that or any other god. You came by this power through unconventional means. And while you do pose a threat, this is larger than myself. As the universe's first unaffiliated chronomancer, there is not exactly a precedent for what is to be done.
She pulled the mittens off her hands and submerged one beneath the rippling waves to scoop stars into her palm. She dipped a finger into the liquid galaxy and began drawing in the blackness above them.
Seek out the other gods of this land.
She drew a small bird before breathing stardust into its form, and it flapped to life.
They will help you learn and observe your choices.
A massive, regal horse pranced around her form, skidding to a stop and spraying the elf with stars.
If you are deemed unworthy.
A tiny mouse ran across her outstretched arms to sit on her shoulder.
If you cannot be taught.
A heavy, wrought-iron tortoise bellowed out a breath of nebular vapor.
Your life will be forfeit to preserve the integrity of all timelines.
Eric swallowed hard as the goddess drew the familiar form of a heavily antlered deer that gazed upon him with hollow eyes. But a grumble replaced that lump in his throat. He did not have time for another quest. He was already on one. He looked over to the woman, an edge in his voice.
And if I don't?
Kidiane only offered him a smile as she looked over his shoulder, inviting him to follow her gaze. He spun, ready to take in the sight of a new universe or galaxy, and instead was filled with a wave of panic and dread. Hovering on the edge between darkness and light was a black hole. It was greedily gulping in entire systems and planets, leaving glittering trails of light that led to its open maw.
You would be one of the select few mortals to feel the terrible hunger of a black hole.
Wrapping an arm around the elf's shoulder, Kidiane pulled them closer to the great void.
Despite how much you may want something, it may not be what you need. Meditate upon that in these times to come. That is your lesson from me.
Eric could only nod frantically, the words and arguments silenced within him. Kidiane turned the elf once more, holding out the remaining stardust in her hand before his face.
Show the other gods that you can be taught, and we will meet back at the beginning.
She smiled before she blew out a breath, scattering the stars in her hands like glitter in the wind. Eric flinched as he was peppered with gritty ash. It filled his nose and his lungs, stung his eyes, and caused him to cough and hack. The surface of the universe tilted hard, and he lost his balance. He toppled out into empty black space. Down and down he fell, tumbling end over end as he struggled to catch his breath. With a crash, his back collided with something solid, painfully hard, and his eyes shot open. He was staring up at the buzzing fluorescent lights in the ceiling of the hospital room. His fists were clutching at the ends of his jacket, the screen dying away as each second passed. He slowly brought one of his hands in front of his face. The blackened fingers sparkled with stardust. It wasn't a dream. And now he was on a quest to prove himself. Wonderful. Eric jolted as a wrinkled, three-toothed grin popped into view.
Ah, welcome back. You had us worried.
You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
Tag, you're it.
Hey, babe, did you see that guy back there?
Huh? What? What guy?
The one lying in the sidewalk.
Nah, didn't see him. A little focused on my research, dear.
Well, I saw him, and I think... Hey, Eric, put that down. I think we should go back. I'm pretty sure that was your brother.
Who? Harold? Couldn't be.
But he looked just like you, only really, really dirty.
Olivia, my brother hasn't spoken to me in years. Last I heard, he wasn't even on this continent.
Right, but...
Even if it was him, I have a meeting with the mayor I can't be late for.
Okay, maybe on the way back then.
Can we get ice cream first?
No time. I'm already late.
Ice cream! You're too little for ice cream. You can't have any.
Hun, I really need...
Oh, baby, of course you can have ice cream. And if Eric doesn't behave, he can give his to that homeless man.
Hey, my ice cream.
Olivia, please.
Daddy's thing first, then ice cream.
Yay!
Fine, but no more distractions. This is important. The mayor needs to know about the impending Bigfoot invasion.
It's a good thing you're cute.
I want sprinkles.